So for the Ukraine, instability in Russia could be a Christmas gift. It could end the war in its favor much more quickly.
Is not in our interest. Whoever comes after Vladimir Putin may not necessarily be better than Vladimir Putin.
Hello and welcome to EURACTIV's Beyond the Byline podcast. I am Yevgeny, and this week we'll look into the recent events that unfolded in Russia, presenting a major domestic crisis for President Vladimir Putin. But how did we get here, and what does this standoff mean for Putin's future, Ukraine and the EU? The Wagner Group, a Russian military contractor, has been actively involved in recent attacks, which has fueled the conflict with the Ministry of Defense. In a bold move on the 24th of June, Prigozhin's troops crossed into the Russian border city of Rostov, asserting their control over military facilities. Reports including videos and images have surfaced revealing armed personnel surrounding administrative buildings in the city center. The exact details of the standoff are still unclear. There's a lot of background that hasn't come to light yet, but it appears to be a significant escalation of boiling tensions.
These tensions have boiled over. They have dealt with a number of issues, including the degree of support and ammunition for Wagner coming from the Russian military, of course, also issues related to Wagner's future as an autonomous force, effectively, as an autonomous fighting force.
Zachary Paikin is a researcher of EU foreign policy at Center for European Policy Studies.
These tensions have gradually been building up, and they've boiled over to a point where, from what we know, clearly it appears as if Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of Wagner, basically couldn't take it anymore and felt that in order to be listened to and to have his demands, which he has vocalized for some time already, be heard, he needed to take more forceful action. But I should really stress that there really is still so much that we don't know about what has occurred and what its implications will be.
On the same day, June 24th, President Vladimir Putin addressed the nation in an emergency televised address, labeling the actions of Prigozhin and his forces as an armed unity. He specifically mentioned that this armed unity orchestrated by the Wagner Group is treason, and he highlighted that he will not tolerate any armed action against the Russian military, and those responsible will be held accountable. The Federal Security Service condemned Prigozhin's actions, labeling them as a call to initiate an armed civil conflict within Russian territory. And it opened a criminal case against Prigozhin and called on Wagner fighters to take measures to detain their leader. From his side, Prigozhin has clarified that his actions do not constitute a military coup, but rather, in his words, a march of justice.
This is not a coup attempt, but a mutiny with a more limited goal. And the goal is essentially to protect the position of Wagner.
Hans Kribbe is director of Brussels Institute for Geopolitics, and he is also ex-advisor on international politics for the Russian government.
And there was a decision in June by the Ministry of Defense, supported by Putin, to wrap this paramilitary company back into the regular army. And this, I think it is increasingly clear, has been an attempt, a desperate attempt, to settle this conflict in Mr. Prigozhin's favor, i.e. to keep this paramilitary company relatively autonomous.
But what are the plausible scenarios following this standoff?
There are, I think, three plausible scenarios. And the one is that Putin still manages to consolidate his power position and continues to be in charge for the next years. There's a presidential election in 2024, next year, and he will win, and he will continue to run the country as before. The second scenario is that this whole episode leads to more infighting among Russian power elites, and in particular parts of the security machinery, and therefore increasing instability, and potentially even a civil war and chaos and the fragmentation of the Russian Federation. And then thirdly, there is a scenario in which there is a controlled handover of power to a new leader, a new figure, a new strongman who can perhaps end the war and manage to unite both Russia's elites and also the people behind him.
As we assess the possible outcomes, the future trajectory remains uncertain, but the stakes are high for both Russia and the West.
It's impossible to know with any certainty at this point because there's still a lot that we don't know about precisely what happened, how much support Prigozhin either had or thought he had within the Russian political and military brass. But for that reason, I think that, there's any range of possibilities. I mean, there are some who are expressing the view that this will, significantly weaken Putin's regime, that effectively that the open rebellion that Prigozhin engaged in was so humiliating for Putin that basically we're just one step away from, the whole edifice collapsing. And then there are others who are of the view that, Putin effectively, one way or another, found a way to see down the threat. He's going to find a way to incorporate or neutralize Wagner going forward. And, you put all that together and effectively, given that most of the elite, ultimately did rally around Putin in this crisis, Putin will further centralize power and perhaps, continue Russia down its path towards increasing authoritarianism and militarism. So it's really, really difficult to tell at this point. And I think that because of that uncertainty, we really should not draw any definitive conclusions right now, because doing so would be really dangerous, right? If we're in a situation right now where, for example, the Ukrainians believe that Putin has been almost fatally weakened, and all it's going to take is one more, significant push on the battlefield in this counteroffensive, and then the whole edifice in Moscow will come crumbling down. But if it turns out that that's not the case in Russia, and that Putin's regime is actually going to demonstrate its resilience and its adaptability as it has so many times in the past, then that could lead to escalation and the war continuing for even longer than it already has.
While this is unfolding in Russia, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky weighed in on the situation, interpreting the armed standoff as evidence of Russia's inherent political instability. At the same time, the West is following the latest developments closely, as Russia's instability causes lots of stress.
So for the Ukraine, instability in Russia, it could be a Christmas gift. It could end the war in its favor much more quickly than otherwise would have been possible. For the EU, I think it can also be a risk, as for the United States, because if we see protracted conflict inside Russia, a civil war with factions and groups in the state fighting each other, that could entail a huge amount of risk, security risk, but also humanitarian crises, migration crises, environmental crises, which will also have repercussions for, in particular, I think, Europe's interest and its security, broadly conceived. So clearly, there is a short-term upside of finishing the war, but in a sense, civil war in Russia can create many, many other problems, and that's why I think the EU should protect itself against that likelihood.
You're listening to EURACTIV's Beyond the Byline podcast. Subscribe to our podcast newsletter on EURACTIV.com/newsletters. And if you want to expand your knowledge in other fields, you can listen to our tech, agri-food, and health podcast. And if you have any comments or ideas, you can drop a line at podcasts@EURACTIV.com. This unfolding crisis also has implications beyond Russia's borders. It raises questions about the regional dynamics, security concerns, and potential opportunities that may arise from this moment of instability.
I'm sure that there are going to be very different voices within the West on this question, and we're seeing that already. There are some who are of the view that instability within Russia is a significant security threat for the West, that is to be avoided or managed at least to some extent. And there are others, of course, who would relish the opportunity, to see through regime change. Unfortunately, I think that there's no real Deus ex machina in the case of this war, because one way or another, it doesn't matter how this war ends. Russia is still going to exist in all likelihood. It's going to be a large power. Maybe it's not a global great power the way it thought it was, but it's going to be a significant player and power of 145 million people in Europe. And it's still going to be there as part of the European security system. And so we're going to have to deal with that challenge one way or another.
Josep Borrell, EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, expressed his concerns about the political instability in Russia, particularly given its status as a nuclear power. The potential nuclear threat adds an additional layer of complexity that must be considered, says Mr. Paikin.
That's absolutely correct. There have been some in the West, more on the hawkish side of the spectrum, who have advocated, some at the real extreme of the spectrum have advocated for Russia's dismemberment as a state. Much as the Soviet Union collapsed, they foresee that Russia, also being a multi-ethnic empire of sorts, is also doomed to collapse. But there are others who would settle simply for regime change, but the preservation of Russia, as an integral state. One way or another, though, that doesn't really solve our problems, right? I mean, the collapse of Russia as a state comes with security risks, not least in the realm of nuclear weapons. The Russian regime change does not transform, effectively, what Russia has been for centuries overnight, which is an empire, which is very different from the rest of Europe, which is based on the concept of sovereign nation states. And the problem with empires, of course, is that they don't have borders in the traditional sense compared to the modern administrative state. And so I think we're seeing that play out right now. And so absolutely, I mean, those who highlight that instability within Russia is not, in our interest are absolutely correct. And I'd go one step further than that, which is to say that, political instability short of state instability in Russia is also not going to solve our problems. I mean, you can say it's within our interests or not, but whoever comes after Vladimir Putin may not necessarily be better than Vladimir Putin, as the events of this past weekend have demonstrated. Now, I'm not saying that Prigozhin was planning on carrying out a full-fledged coup and becoming the president himself. His future in Russian politics after Putin has left the scene is very much open to debate. But I think the episode just highlights the extent to which, although we would all love to see Russia become more open, more democratic, more oriented towards the West, there are limits to which that is likely to happen, especially given the fact that, compared to 30 years ago, compared to the late 80s and early 90s, the West appears as less of a model that Russians want to emulate, in comparison with the end of the Cold War and the transition effectively to capitalism and to liberal democracy that took place at that time with the collapse of the Iron Curtain.
Looking ahead, Russia's current situation is likely to be a prominent discussion at the upcoming European Council meeting on the 29th of June. But according to Mr. Kribbe, we shouldn't expect much coming out from the European Council meetings.
I wouldn't expect too much from the European Council in this regard. The EU has commented on the goings-on in the last few days as an internal matter for Russia, and I think that is the correct line to take. So I don't expect a big statement from the European Council at this moment. The war is continuing. I think attention is and needs to shift back to supporting Ukraine in the best possible and in the safest possible way to win the war in its own country. I think that's where discussions can continue, should continue, rather than speculating or seeking to interfere in Russia itself or to stimulate some regime change in the country. I think that is not the way that the EU should now look.
Amidst this uncertainty, questions arise about Russia's future without Putin. Is it better with or without him? And what would a post-Putin Russia look like?
This is a significant event, obviously, that took place. Its repercussions are very difficult to know at this point, but I would avoid drawing the conclusion that this is, basically the beginning of the end. It could be, at least as it relates to this phase of hostilities. Then again, it might not be. It could be that this war in its current phase or in a slightly slower phase will continue for many years to come as both sides entrench themselves. And I think we should be absolutely very worried about that. And there really is no deus ex machina. Russia's going to be there. They're going to be a problem that we're going to have to manage, and we should not put our faith in easy solutions coming about. We are going to have to wrestle with this challenge for a long, long time, including how we find some sort of way to avoid the risk of escalation and enhance security on the European continent in the short term. And also thinking about, given that Russia geographically remains in Europe, what legitimate place it could potentially be accorded, and what the timeline, what the conditions might be for that over the longer term. And that's going to require some very, very difficult questions. And I'm sure that EU member states are not going to be on the same page as it relates to that. But that doesn't negate the necessity of talking about these things.
And Mr. Kribbe, what's your take on this?
That we should be realistic about the future without Putin. And I think Russia is very unlikely to become a liberal European-style democracy that we may want it to become. If Putin goes and is replaced in a controlled and managed handover, we are very likely to see continuity between his style of politics and that of his successor. It is unlikely that there will be a huge and deep reform that will swing Russia back into the Western camp in geopolitics. Russia has certain sovereign interests, and these are shared as an important goal by the entire elite. There is, of course, the possibility that a new man at the top has freedom to end the war, which has, of course, been a disaster for Russia. But beyond that, I'm quite skeptical that we see a much better Russia. Indeed, we may see a worse neighbor for Europe. Russian nationalism is a more potent political force. Extreme right nationalism is a more potent political force than liberalism in Russia. And that is something that is a possibility that we have to watch very closely, that a future leader will not be a liberal, but be an autocrat, and perhaps even more autocratic than Putin.
Thank you very much. I am Yevgeny, and this was EURACTIV's Beyond the Byline podcast. Visit EURACTIV to stay on top of the latest news, and if you haven't subscribed to the podcast, you can do so on your favorite podcasting app. This episode was produced by myself, and I want to thank our executive producer, Malte Kettelsen. Thank you for tuning in, and until next week.